Hi everyone, this is Tom West, and I just wanted to put together this video to talk a little bit about training for team sports. A lot of the classes that I teach talk specifically about training for endurance events or sprint events and so on. I think often we forget about how to best train our team sport athletes, however. And this can often be challenging because the nature of team sports varies from sport to sport, can even vary from position to position. So in order to train somebody effectively, I really think we need to understand what are the forces and the loads that are applied to the tissues of the body and the different systems of the body so that we can best design a training program to help them prepare for those types of challenges. As an athletic trainer, I often was tasked with working with a wide range of sports. Some of these sports I knew a lot about, and some I did not. For instance, in my time working at George Washington University, I worked with men's water polo. I knew very little about water polo, but yet I was tasked with, again, taking care of these athletes, their injuries, doing rehab programs to get them back into their sport. And to do so, I needed to learn about the sport. What are the demands of the sport? What motions are produced by different joints? If I had an athlete with an injured shoulder, I needed to understand what does the shoulder do during water polo. I needed to understand how they use it when they swim around the pool to get to various locations, but then also how they use that arm when they're throwing and shooting and so on. So again, I think we need to make sure we learn about the sports that our athletes and clients participate in so that we can be more effective in designing training programs. One way to do this is to look into the literature. I know I point to the literature a lot, but I think there's a lot of ways that we can use the research that's been done to help guide our practice. And this is another example of that. So again, what I wanted to do in this presentation was talk a little bit about how we can use information that maybe is out in the literature to learn more about a sport, learn more what the expectations are of the athletes that participate in the sport, and then use that information to design training programs that are going to be the most effective and prepare them for that participation. Now, I am not a sports coach, so I'm really not trying to focus as much on the actual skill development. I'm more looking at how can we encourage the body to, the heart, the lungs, the skeletal system, the muscular system, be better prepared to respond to the loads that this sport places upon them, and therefore they're going to perform at a higher level. We're going to help reduce the risk of injury and hopefully help the team become more successful. So there's lots of studies out there on a wide range of sports that have examined various components of activity. And again, when you go out and look, I'm going to use some examples from soccer for this presentation. But if you look at soccer in particular, there are studies where they have measured how much each athlete moves around the field, how fast they move, what total distance do they move, how many times do they change direction, do they sprint, how often do they sprint, how long are those sprints, and all of that information really is key to designing a training program because we want to prepare them for the things they're going to actually do. Always would frustrate me when I have coaches that are doing activities that are not at all like the actual demands that are placed upon the athlete during participation. We should always be doing activities that are going to prepare them for the participation in their specific activity. So again, there's a lot of studies out there. I'm going to link to a number of them and provide them in the reference list here for this presentation, but where they've attached, again, GPS devices or analyzed video of games to look at player movement. They've attached accelerometers or some combination of these different procedures to really get some very specific information about how an athlete moves in a particular sporting event. So they'll look at things like, again, distance covered, how much time or what percentage of the total participation time the athlete is engaged in high intensity activities, and again, also how much they're in recovery or lower intensity activities. They'll look at, again, how often do they sprint, how many times do they sprint in a given game, what is the average distance of that sprint. And again, we can use that information to guide our training program development. They'll examine movement analysis. So again, not just how much distance they move, but how much time do they spend moving forward and backward? How much do they time do they spend moving side to side? How much time do they spend jumping and landing, moving in an upward and downward direction? And then also looking at things like how often do they change direction? And again, what are the acceleration and deceleration forces during those changes in direction? Again, all interesting and important things that we can use in designing programs. They'll also look at things like time of participation, and then also consider factors like substitution rules, how much of a break can the athlete get? And in some sports, substitution rules are very open, and we can move athletes very freely in and off the court or field, such as basketball. So when a player is winded or tired, they can be pulled from the game, allowed to recover, and then put back in. Or you have sports like soccer where very limited substitution is available, and most athletes are going to participate for the whole 90-minute game. And then they've even broken down some of these factors based upon the position that the person plays. Because again, you may train a forward very differently than a defender in soccer, because some of the demands are different in terms of, again, how they move about the field. So again, using soccer as an example, and again, I will, if you're in my class, I will link to these articles and share them with you as a PDF. If you aren't in my class or watching this on the web, I have a list of the references at the back of this presentation. Feel free to look them up and find them yourself. But there are a lot of other studies that are very similar. So in team sports, such as soccer, we see a number of studies that will look at things like the distance that's covered, the total distance that's covered during the event. They'll look at positional differences. Again, often in sports like soccer and field hockey, we see very different types of movements, a lot more or less sprints, depending upon if the person is a forward or a defender. They'll also spend a much greater or lesser amount of time in high-intensity activities. Again, a midfielder in soccer, for instance, spends much more time in a higher intensity type activity than potentially the defenders do. And then they'll look at things like how often change of direction occurs, what are the speeds at which they change direction, and so on. And again, one study pointed to soccer where they said often soccer athletes will change direction up to 1,000 times in a given match, which is crazy, but also is something we have to consider when we're designing these programs. We have to prepare the body for these sudden changes in direction by including those types of activities in our training programs. They'll look at things like speed and endurance, also movement efficiency. Were they wise in making their movement choices? And again, especially in lower level sporting activities, we see that athletes do spend a lot more time chasing the ball when maybe they shouldn't be. And that's a skill portion of the activity as well. But there is some evidence looking at World Cup and high level of soccer activities that more successful teams move in specific ways. They tend to cover more distance. They tend to sprint more frequently and therefore are prepared to do so. They've been trained to do this. So again, there is some evidence that if we can develop these physiological capabilities, it will enhance the overall performance of the team. So let's talk in specific now about soccer. And again, from reading these articles, so these are some of the things that I've learned that I might use if I was designing a training program or a rehabilitation program for a soccer athlete. There was one study that was performed that examined 2010 World Cup soccer players. They took all the videos of the soccer matches from the 2010 World Cup and measured how much each player moved in these videos throughout the entire game. And they found that on average, soccer participants in the World Cup covered approximately 6 to 8 miles per game. So again, that's a number that we can utilize in developing some of our training programs. So we know that they cover about 6 to 8 miles per game, and that's over a 90-minute game. So we know about, again, how much distance we may want to cover in our training programs to simulate a game type situation. In the 2014 World Cup, a similar study was performed, and they looked much more specifically at some other measures. They looked again at the distance covered, and they found about, on average, 6 to 6.5 miles were covered per game. That's not meters, that's miles. And again, the mean time that they spent in high intensity activities for that total 6 miles was about 8.8%. So 8 to 9% of the time they were engaging in high intensity activities, which they counted as sprints that were 12 miles per hour or greater. And again, we saw this more frequently in certain positions, specifically midfielders. Midfielders tended to cover a greater distance and spend a greater amount of time in high-intensity activities. So again, if we're training soccer athletes, we may want to keep that in mind as well. They found that the number of sprints were considered to be anything over 15.6 miles per hour. On average, in all matches, there was a sprint by a player approximately every 3 minutes, just under 3 minutes. So again, as far as timing of maybe our interval training for these athletes, that can be useful information. Although they found that more successful teams made sprints more frequently, on the average of about 80 seconds or so. So we may want to keep that in mind as well. So again, this is the type of information that you can gain from these articles that you then can use as you develop potentially these training programs for your athletes and your clients. This is a fairly detailed table. This is from Andrzejewski's article. Again, I have a link to that as well. And what they've done in this article is looked at a number of factors, but specifically they focused on positional differences, and they further broke down positions, not just forward, midfield, and defender, but also looked at the external midfielders and external defenders compared to the middle players that play in the middle of the field. And again, looked at distance covered, sprinting distance, and the percentage of time they spent sprinting. So again, just useful information that you can use to potentially develop this training program for your soccer athletes and individualize it based upon the position that they play or play most frequently. So based on these articles, and again, there are very similar articles that you may find in field hockey, basketball, a lot of other team sports, we can make some recommendations. The first is obviously in soccer, we really need to train all three energy systems because these athletes spend a lot of time moving, cover approximately 8 miles, 6 to 8 miles potentially in a given match, which certainly is an aerobic type of an event. But within that 6 to 8 miles, they spend a good bit of time sprinting as well, and therefore we need to train all three energy systems. They have a very high demand placed upon their ATP-PC system for these very quick bouts of sprinting. So we have to train all three energy systems for these athletes based upon the literature and certainly based just on casual observation. Chimura's article made some recommendations based upon what they saw in the World Cup. And again, I think these filter down to lower levels of soccer as well, but they obviously think that the athletes have a high level of aerobic capacity. So we really need to focus on developing these athletes as endurance athletes. And they sprinted, especially the more successful teams, sprinted on average about every 82 seconds. So if we're developing an interval type training program, we need to keep that in mind. And the teams that were most successful were able to not only sprint frequently, but could sprint at very high speeds. So it is important for our soccer players to not only develop sprint endurance and overall aerobic endurance, but we want to enhance their top speed because that was important for the most successful teams. And this is at all positions. Andrzejewski made some recommendations. They observed professional soccer players in the Europa League, and they found that, again, we really need to focus on developing sprint speed, but at appropriate distances, approximately 20 meters at most, and then also maybe mimic or attempt to mimic the active rest periods that soccer players take advantage of when they can kind of recover and be ready for that next sprint. That means that we need to do types of training that's going to enhance the regeneration of phosphocreatine to be used by the ATP-PC system, which again all makes sense, but again is something we need to consider as we develop these programs. So again, by looking at these types of research articles, we can gain some really practical insights as to how to potentially best train these types of athletes. Now, another study that I found quite interesting because it considered soccer training and some of the abilities that we need to develop in these athletes a little bit differently. And this study was by Benham, and they looked at the use of small-sided games. So again, if you've ever worked with soccer or played soccer, the coaches often will do these games where it's 2-on-2, 3-on-3 on a smaller field, small goals, and so on, with the idea of, again, it's kind of more of a skill development. The athletes get more touches per minute and so on. And it kind of works on moving through a more condensed or constricted area, and again, develops things like, again, being able to handle the ball and keep it away from defenders, etc. And what they found was that, again, obviously soccer involves a lot of running and sprinting and so on, but not all of the activities are that we kind of consider low intensity based upon these video analyses are necessarily low intensity. So just because an athlete isn't moving fast or covering a large amount of distance doesn't mean that they're working at a low intensity level. They spend a lot of time jumping, accelerating, and decelerating very quickly, tackling, physical contact with another player where they're pushing on one another, that maybe they don't get up to a high speed, but still is very intense and is going to be very taxing on the athlete. So we have to keep that in mind when we are developing some of these training programs, because it's not all sprinting at top speed. A lot of times it's accelerating very quickly, but then decelerating right away because there's a change in direction of ball movement, etc. So we have to keep that in mind as well when we're developing these programs. And this study in particular looked at the use of these modified field size and small-sided games as a way to manipulate the loads and the energy systems that maybe are utilized in these athletes. So small-sided games on a larger field can actually enhance the number of sprints that are performed and enhance some of this high-intensity activity that may occur, which not only can help develop soccer skills, but also can develop this sprinting ability that seems to be so important in, enhancing overall performance. And these small-sided games can provide what they used as a term, a greater density of training, which is going to create some greater taxation on the cardiovascular system, as well as on connective tissue and muscular tissue that's involved in acceleration and deceleration. Because these games require much more frequent changes of direction and acceleration and deceleration, they might be a way to enhance the development of these tissues to respond and absorb those types of forces. So again, that's an article that I would encourage you to take a look at, because it thinks, again, outside of the box in terms of developing some of these training programs that we can utilize in development of an overall strategy for developing our soccer athletes. So a lot of cool articles out there. I just tried to pick some that really were interesting, but there's a lot more out there. All of the articles I've spoken about are listed here on this reference list. I encourage you to go and take a look at them, but also take a look at the reference lists in these articles, because there are a lot of studies that have examined the activity of soccer players and the loads that are placed upon the different tissues and systems of the human body during participation. As I've said, there are a lot of other sports that have been examined in a very similar way. And again, by reading these types of articles, you certainly can glean some really important information and get some ideas of how to best train these athletes. So I've placed a couple articles here that are examples of this that, again, highlight some of the challenges that are posed to field hockey players, basketball athletes, and so on. But again, I think if you go online and you search for articles looking at things like motion analysis and the sport that you're interested in, you'll find a lot of similar types of studies that may help you in developing these programs for these athletes, especially in the event where you're working with an athlete that participates in a sport that you aren't real familiar with. So anyway, I hope that this presentation was interesting for you. I hope it gives you some ideas now of resources that may be out there to help you develop training programs for athletes that participate in team sports.